primeval jungles of southwest New Guinea, all the modern resources of the civilized world are employed in the search for the explorer son of New York's Governor Nelson Rockefeller. An expedition seeking primitive art brought 23-year-old Michael Rockefeller.
A frozen frame from 1969. A war canoe cuts through the waters of Papua New Guinea. The warriors paddle in unison, but one figure is wrong.
Michael Rockefeller had graduated from Harvard and immediately signed up to be the sound technician on a film in the highlands of New Guinea, an ethnographic film about the Dani.
Pale skin, a beard, Western features. Researchers zoom in, and their faces drain of color. Could this be Michael Rockefeller, the heir who vanished 8 years earlier? The official story claimed he drowned, but whispers from the jungle told of vengeance, ritual, and a cover-up spanning decades. Today, we follow the trail from the moment his boat capsized to the shocking image that reignited the mystery. The heir with a different dream. In the United States of the early 1960s, few names commanded such instant recognition as Rockefeller. Michael Rockefeller was born into that legacy, the great-grandson of John D. Rockefeller, founder of Standard Oil, and the son of Nelson Rockefeller, governor of New York and future vice president of the United States. From birth, he inhabited a world of marble interiors, political conversation at the dinner table, and an unspoken script for his life. A career in public office, high finance, or another arena befitting one of America's most powerful families. Michael, however, possessed a temperament that resisted the obvious path. Bright, engaging, and restless, he preferred exploration to predictability. At Harvard, where he studied history and economics, his curiosity turned toward art and anthropology, especially forms beyond the Western tradition. While friends prepared resumes for law firms or investment banks, he was tracking down books on indigenous rituals and poring over photographs of ceremonial objects from distant continents. The opening of the Museum of Primitive Art in 1957, a project spearheaded by his father, became a turning point. Though its name reflected the era's terminology, the collection itself, masks from West Africa, carved ancestor figures from Oceania, stone sculpture from Mesoamerica, was unlike anything in mainstream American galleries. Michael walked its halls repeatedly, studying the weight of a carving, the grain of a mask, or the symmetry in a sculpture's design. These were not curiosities for him, but living expressions of belief and identity. Michael met anthropologists and field workers at the museum whose professional lives had taken them to faraway communities. Such stories threw open windows upon cultures fashioned in isolation, where art was deeply intertwined with religion, and where history was preserved through wood, fiber, and stone. One area, in particular, fastened itself into his mind: the southwestern coast of what was nominally then Dutch New Guinea, the territory of the Asmat. Asmat culture is famous for wood carving, especially for monumental bis poles, one-trunk sculptures rising like a totem and adorned with spiral motifs in human forms. Each pole recounted and spoke of ancestral history, clan identity, and the cycles of life and death. They believed that a death would rupture the cosmic balance, and to heal that wound, there had to be a retribution against the offenders. The BIS poles sat at the center of the ceremonies that sanctioned these obligations. Michael felt these works were on a par with the very best from Europe. He saw them in New York not as trophies of the exotic, but as cultural equals of Renaissance paintings or classical sculpture. He believed such viewing would lead to mutual respect across the divide of geography and history. In 1961, having made a short visit to the area in the preceding year, Michael made up his mind to return with a clearer objective: to bring back carvings, chiefly bis poles, for the Museum of Primitive Art. That entailed a venture deep into territory accessible only by canoe, through the mangrove forest and up winding rivers. He would work with Dutchman René Wassing, and depend on local men experienced with the tides and canals. Writings in the days before departure swirled with excitement. The Asmat, as he wrote, were a people exemplary in vigor, their art the purest expression of their belief in life. The journey, in his mind, would be a mutual exchange of ideas as much as the acquisition of things. Even though Michael's friends appreciated his fixation, they recognized the handicaps: uncharted territory, sensitive intercultural relationships, and the political cloud that hung over the fragile future of Dutch New Guinea. Colonial administration occurrences and nationalist aspirations were gripping the territory during that time, until a few outsiders forged lasting ties with the Asmat, whose villages are located on the riverbanks and on the coasts, rarely mapped in detail. Michael, nevertheless, had no doubts that such openness and respect could even bridge over the widest divide. But he had no way of foreseeing that just these very factors that had drawn him to the Asmat, their honoring of long-held traditions, their guardedness towards outsiders, and their sense of balance and justice, would somehow blend into a series of events that would learn his name not in terms of the art he aimed to share, but rather in terms of the enigma surrounding his disappearance. But the people he admired had a history outsiders didn't understand, and that gap could prove fatal. The catamaran disaster. On the morning of November 18, 1961, Michael Rockefeller was far from the world of galleries and political chambers. He stood on a 40-foot catamaran, two narrow canoes lashed together, powered by a small outboard motor, moving along the southern coast of Dutch New Guinea. His companions were Dutch anthropologist René Wassing and two teenage Asmat guides, Simon and Leo. Their planned route would take them across the mouth of a broad river that emptied into the Arafura Sea, a place known to local navigators for unpredictable water, where sediment-laden brown met ocean blue in roiling turbulence. The early weather gave little warning. The motor's steady hum carried them forward until the rhythm of the sea shifted. Cross currents began to lift the swells, the boat pitching under each hit. Salt spray lashed across the deck. A sudden breaker crashed against the hull, drenching the motor. Michael pulled the starter cord. The engine sputtered but failed. He tried again, with no better result. The guides joined in the effort, their movements practiced. But the motor remained dead. Without propulsion, the catamaran was left completely at the mercy of the sea. Waves poured over the deck, forcing all four men to bail water with whatever containers were at hand. Water levels would drop, only to rise again. Simon and Leo had a quick discussion and then announced they were heading for shore, estimating it was within swimmable distance. Michael and René compared the currents with the safety of waiting on board and opted for the latter. Hours passed under a brooding sky. The wooden structure creaked while accepting more water. By late afternoon, it was hit by a larger wave that struck broadside and capsized the cat. Michael and René came to the surface alongside the upside-down hull, which was nonetheless afloat due to trapped pockets of air. Two empty fuel cans were tied to Michael's waist for buoyancy. Drifted away by wind and current, they were now farther away. Night fell, with darkness so oppressive and complete, turning the coastline invisible. No light shone, no distant engines droned in the darkness. They floated in the blackness, chilled by the wind, their muscles knotting with exposure. They were a pair who spoke little for energy conservation, but had their situations made even more precarious by the gradual drift into open water. Dawn had broken on November 19th, but although the sea had calmed, the coast lay even farther away. The farthest horizon was devoid of rescue, and except for that faraway line of land, Michael, an accomplished swimmer over long distances, began to ponder what had been well in his thoughts. He told René he believed he could reach shore, though the distance was likely to be 10 miles or more. At around 8 o'clock, he stripped off his remaining clothes and set aside the makeshift flotation at his waist. He shook René's hand, his voice even as he said, "I think I can make it." Michael slipped silently into the water, glassy and cool under the early light. For a moment, he lay floating beside the overturned hull, judging the strength of the current, and then began a steady crawl toward the unseen shore. Each stroke drew him farther and farther away from the only solid thing still left in sight, his figure shrinking against the vast expanse. René watched in silence, the sound of splashes slowly fading, until the only thing left was the low lap of waves against wood. Alone now, he gripped the slippery hull and waited, the horizon keeping its secrets. He thought he was heading toward safety. The shoreline held something else entirely: politics in the shadows. When word reached Dutch authorities that Michael Rockefeller was missing, it collided with a volatile political landscape. In 1961, Dutch New Guinea, the western half of the island now known as Papua, was among the last remnants of the Netherlands colonial empire. The Dutch intended to prepare its indigenous population for eventual independence under their oversight. Indonesia, newly independent and eager to expand its influence, claimed the territory as its own, pointing to shared cultural heritage with the rest of the archipelago. International powers were watching. The United Nations weighed diplomatic alignments. But in truth, strategic advantage often outweighed promises of self-determination. By the time Michael's catamaran overturned, Indonesia had already begun sending forces into the territory. Skirmishes broke out between Papuan villagers aligned with Dutch patrols and pro-Indonesian infiltrators. The Dutch grip was fragile, and any sign of instability risked undermining their position in ongoing negotiations. The disappearance of a Rockefeller, son of a sitting U.S. governor, member of one of America's wealthiest families, had explosive potential. If the story were one of a misadventure at sea, damage control was possible. But a death suffered at the hands of local Papuans, especially among groups the Dutch claimed to be civilizing, would be seized eagerly by Indonesia as proof that the Netherlands could not maintain order. In Hollandia, the colonial capital, orders resounded swiftly. A large-scale search would be undertaken, with military detachments, constabulary forces, and missionary outposts alike called to assist. Aircraft would skim the coastline, while boats would harry the river mouths. Soldiers made their way through the mangrove swamp. Officially, they were to find Michael alive or recover his remains. Unofficially, any evidence that would suggest the locals were implicated in his death would be buried. The official story had to be that of a maritime tragedy. That concern was also tied to Dutch representations of their rule. For decades, colonial officials had made pronouncements declaring headhunting and cannibalism as things of the past, banished from the scene by the steady hand of Western governance. However, anthropologists acquainted with the area were aware that this was not true. Selected Asmat communities continued to operate under traditional cycles of justice, incorporating vengeance slayings that were necessary to restore spiritual balance. An open acknowledgement of such would draw away from the carefully manufactured image of progress and pacification. Rumor, however, had opportunities to secure a track. Missionaries penetrating far inland made sporadic shoutings of white men being seen in faraway villages. A trader moving slowly along the coast gathered hearsay about an outsider being detained. Such accounts were vague, uncorroborated, and easy to disallow in official reports. Yet, they persisted through informal channels. In such a place where news traveled slowly, and where rumors were known to influence morale and diplomacy, even unsubstantiated talk meant a lot. At the same time, the Rockefeller family in New York was using its own resources. Connections of Nelson Rockefeller allowed rapid transmittal across borders and institutions. A huge financial incentive was put on the table, a $250,000 reward for any credible information leading to Michael's apparently being alive or death. That amount was staggering for the time and indicated the great urgency that the family attached to the search. Nevertheless, Dutch intelligence files were not opened to an American eye. Reports were made by local informants shortly after Michael was said to have been lost, classified, and stored. It was firmly held. No evidence of foul play, no justification for altering the narrative. For the Dutch, the political fallout loomed larger in their calculations than the advantages of enlightenment. In this atmosphere, a word could be dangerous. Any chatter surrounding Michael's plight sat under the shadows of international politics. The disappearance, in the minds of Dutch officials, was not just a human tragedy, but an incipient diplomatic weapon that could be unleashed against them. Control of the narrative became just as important as the search for Michael. In that climate, even whispers could be dangerous. But whispers began anyway. The investigators' clues. Nelson Rockefeller was not satisfied with the Dutch conclusion that his son had drowned. Michael's strong swimming ability and endurance made it plausible that he could have reached shore. The absence of any trace troubled the family. Quietly, they chose to conduct their own inquiry, one unbound by the limitations of the official search. A private investigator was sent to Dutch New Guinea with discreet but firm instructions. Go beyond the areas already combed, speak to people overlooked by government teams, and follow leads without the constraints of colonial politics. The terrain made this a slow process. Much of the coastline was reachable only by canoe. Inland, villages maintained their own systems of justice, and outsiders needed time, and often gifts, to gain trust. A prospective input came from a person wanting to part with information about a boat engine. What he threw at them was 3 human skulls. He said they were the remains of white men slain by the villagers many moons ago, and when asked if one was Michael's, he answered without batting an eye, yes. It's difficult to verify claims made in the field. The skulls were not tagged, and there was impossible field testing capacity to conduct forensic tests on site. The investigator took them to the U.S. Their fate after arrival is unknown. No public records indicate they were ever tested. Nevertheless, there are documents showing the investigator was awarded a sum of $250,000 from the Rockefeller family, which is the very amount that was hanging as a reward for credible information. Another meeting scored high on the discomfort index, though. One day, in a village, the investigator met an old man wearing wire-rimmed glasses of Western style, a rare sort in such an environment. When asked where he obtained them, the man would only say, "I found them." Later, while comparing photographs of Michael in the field, the investigator noticed the frames and tinted lenses resembled what Michael had worn. The datum was not positive, but still troublesome. Inevitably, when such leads were inquired about, it was primarily a matter of context. By interpreters, the narrative always moved from mouth to mouth, modified with every sing-along. Verification was slow due to the region's remoteness. For decades, in relation to some objects or rites, events could be neatly memorialized within local memory. To weigh not only the plausibility of each account for the investigator, but also the possibility that it might have been shaped by the wishes of the listener. It provides reach and thus limits the search. They were able to travel, barter, and negotiate in quiet that sometimes official channels would not cover. But their prominence meant that any such discovery would have political implications. The Dutch authorities, apparently still guarding their version of things, were not at all interested in cooperating with any parallel investigation that might lead to rather inconvenient conclusions. No conclusive evidence was found by the end of the investigator's term of office. The skulls, the eyeglasses, the second-hand reports, they all remained unresolved pieces. Yet they formed a pattern that suggested perhaps Michael's story ended not in the open sea. Whether these fragments pointed to his fate or merely reflected the persistence of rumor, they deepened the puzzle Probably the best thing they said for Nelson was that he did not know. Without evidence, the official version stood intact in the records. But it was not the end of the problem for the family and for those who had worked the rivers and trails of Dutch New Guinea. Did Michael ever set foot on the ground only to face a different kind of risk? But the most detailed account wouldn't surface until half a century later, from inside the tribe itself. Hoffman's breakthrough. By the time journalist Carl Hoffman arrived in Papua in 2014, more than 50 years had passed since Michael Rockefeller's disappearance. Official records listed him as drowned. Yet in riverside villages and among the few outsiders who knew the Asmat coast, the story still circulated in low voices. Hoffman's interest had started decades earlier, when, as a boy, he saw Michael's face in an old magazine under the headline, "Heir Disappears in New Guinea." The image and the mystery had never left him. Hoffman's approach was not to retrace the grid of the original search or reopen evidence long buried in archives. Instead, he planned to settle among the Asmat, share daily routines, and quietly listen. He knew the subject was one that had remained taboo for decades and would not be broached quickly. Through an interpreter, he moved from village to village. Hearing fragments of memory, people were cautious. Outsiders, particularly white outsiders, had been asking questions about Michael for years, and not all had left goodwill behind. In one settlement beside the river where Michael had once tried to purchase a bispole, Hoffman's interpreter happened to overhear a most unexpected conversation. Two men were arguing back and forth informally, warning each other to avoid mentioning "the one we slain" in the presence of visiting foreigners. Hoffman questioned them flatly. To his surprise, they spoke with great openness. Michael Rockefeller had been slain decades ago in their village. They apparently regarded this statement as being as casual as one might be in recounting a matter of record. The explanation probably dates back to 1957. It was then that Dutch colonial troops moved into the area to halt the violent confrontation between the two villages among the Asmat. They advanced into the area, rifles in hand, to impose order, but created confusion instead. Believing this was an attack, some villagers charged with spears in anger. The soldiers opened fire, resulting in the slaying of several men, among them respected warriors. Such losses in Asmat tradition required retribution. Leaving them unavenged would be considered dishonor to the dead and disruption of the spiritual order. The difficulty was, however, that the slayers were outsiders, both Dutch and white, and opportunities to avenge them were sparse. Anthropologists have long reported the Asmat view of justice as wholly associated with spiritual duty. The decision made by the village elder fell into that exact pattern. Two Dutch missionaries spent years in the region and were fluent in the language, and members of the community clicked well with them. They later confirmed to Hoffman that they too had heard the same story being narrated in hushed tones over the decades. The story's consistency and the lack of bravado in narrating it made it more believable. For Hoffman, it was indeed the most straightforward statement regarding the fate of Michael. It was a story that linked the disappearance not with fate or natural catastrophe, but with a precise historical chain and a set of cultural obligations. Yet, just at the moment when this account seemed to offer grim clarity, an unrelated discovery would undermine the very sense of closure he had begun to feel. And just as this grim picture formed, a forgotten film reel added an entirely different twist: the man in the canoe. In 1969, 8 years after Michael Rockefeller vanished, American adventure journalist Milt Macklin traveled to Papua New Guinea with a small film crew. He was pursuing rumors of a white man living among the Asmat and believed that if anyone could verify them, it might be him. Over weeks of travel, Macklin filmed village life, river expeditions, and ceremonial gatherings. But he returned without the breakthrough he had hoped for. No verified sighting, no revealing interview. The reels of film were boxed and stored. For decades, the footage remained untouched. Macklin moved on to other projects, and the Rockefeller mystery faded back into speculation. Nearly 40 years later, another documentary team, researching Michael's case, uncovered the reels in storage. They began transferring the film to a digital format and examined it frame by frame. One photograph, the last in an incidental series, was in circulation. Among the warriors of the Asmat, warriors with their bodies smeared in paint, wore canoeing across the waters would be a paddler with a somewhat lighter complexion. His features, slightly concealed from full view, appeared partly to belong to a Westerner, whilst a thick beard graced his chin. Above his naked torso, he wore the same traditional ornaments as other canoeists. The still shot was blown up and passed around all those who could recognize the features of Michael. Comparisons were made to other pictures dating to 1961. Jawline, the shape of the eyes, build of the torso. Features that supporters of the survival theory jumped on, while suggesting that Michael must have found himself on dry land, and, instead of being captured, was accepted into the community, whose admiration he had felt. Unquestionably romantic, the idea is of an heir to a great fortune, who turned his back on privilege to live among a people whose art and worldview he found captivating. For believers, the image was much more than a mere coincidence. It was a rare glimpse into one possible ending. A quick counter by the skeptics. The man had his face partly turned away, and the features were blurred by the grain of a decades-old film. The skin tone could have been altered by light, shadow, and reflections on water. There were relatively few Western visitors before the 1970s, missionaries and traders and anthropologists among them, who could have been the artist in question. Without something definitive to hang one's hat on, the image remains suggestive, but inconclusive. The debate had been kicked around in books, documentary films, and websites. Some felt that the canoe man offered surreal alternatives to the more violent versions of Michael's death. Others felt it took attention from more credible observations, an ambiguous entity elevated beyond worth with its diffusion. The emotional resonance of the clip, nonetheless, was not lost on anyone, irrespective of their proposed insights. For long, the majority of accounts of Michael's last hours were anchored in grim inevitability. This piece of footage, by the slightest chance, ushered in the possibility of a different outcome. It did not offer a harder solution to the puzzle. It transformed the riddle into a living question that official reports had long buried. Yet the tribe's own version of events leaves little room for such hope. The ritual slaying. According to the most guarded stories within the Asmat villages, Michael Rockefeller's final day did not end with rescue or adoption. It ended with a decision, one rooted in tradition, obligation, and events that predated his arrival by years. In these accounts, Michael reached the shore after his long swim, exhausted and disoriented. The tide had carried him toward a stretch of coast near a settlement that rarely saw outsiders. Hunters walking the shoreline at dawn first mistook him for an animal in the surf. Only as they approached did they see his pale skin and realize he was a foreigner. He is an enemy to all villagers, including slayers, and in this case, any outside white. Away from the end that made two equal, one has now come flying from nowhere before their eyes, as if brought by the sea itself. The elders conferred as quickly as possible. The witnesses told Hoffman that they agreed Michael would become the one to close the age-old score. This was not a hint that they were privy to either his name or his background. What mattered was that he was identifiably an outsider from the world of soldiers. Choice was not set as a personal revenge, but rather in the sense attached to the duty concerning the community and the spirits of the dead. The agreement set in motion a sequence that no individual could halt. Once the decision was reached, the outcome was carried forward by a shared understanding among the villagers. a momentum born from collective memory and spiritual debt. From the youngest onlookers to the oldest elders, each knew their place in the unfolding act, and in that knowledge, the responsibility shifted from a handful of leaders to the entire community. Michael was taken into an inland clearing much farther away from the shore. Around him, villages had gathered in rhythm, chanting, marking moments of great action. For ceremonies in Asmat's tradition, such moments are entirely different from tumultuous moments and are highly formalized, with each attendee having a given specific role. The chants, the instruments, and the movements would be steps towards a ritual whose aim is to honor the spirits and not to leave the act go astray in its intended weight. According to the reports, Michael would understand very little of what was happening since he had been fairly weakened by the swim and was now pretty much not able to barter words with his captors. The chants loomed above like a wall of solidity surrounding him. To Asmat, it meant preparation, as well as a signal-soundly constructed bridge to the other spiritual realm. This was not cruelty, but tradition. The first blow was to be administered by a chosen warrior, after which no return could be made. Afterward, it will be derived and mean symbolic rather than true. By carrying out the act, the community believed that they had corrected what had been disturbed by the events of 1957. Now, what happened next was also according to the oral histories published. Parts of the body of Michael were ritually disposed of in forms which were supposed to absorb the strength of the fallen and honor the spirits. In their worldview of the Asmat, nothing is wasted, but everything is full of meaning, and a piece of bone can go into spears and tools, and symbolic blood from Michael sprinkled on the ceremonial dances. For them, these were not trophies in the Western sense, but just physical reminders of an order restored. Up until the days of the stranger from the sea, tales coming from the shores traveled quickly across the banks of the rivers and inland paths, interlacing with the many stories of other remembered happenings. Among the Asmat, such happenings were not isolated incidents. They were part of an ongoing narrative of balance between the living and the realms of spirits. But for the outsiders, the whole thing seemed rather strange, sudden, and incomprehensible. In the villages, it became another chapter, a long one indeed, in the book of obligations fulfilled, a story to be retold around the fire as the night pressed close and the voices of ancestors seemed to listen. If this story gripped you, remember that history is full of mysteries where official records and local memory tell entirely different tales. Like, comment, and subscribe, and watch the next video for another story the history books left out.